Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. This is a story that has been passed down in fragments, carried through generations with a weight that never really lifts. Even now, long after the war ended and the world moved on, it still feels close, like something that happened just yesterday rather than decades ago. It happened in my grandfather's village, a small place that barely registered on maps, the kind of village that existed quietly, shaped by routine, hard work, and family ties. Before the war reached it, life there was simple, in the way rural life often is. People knew each other, families were large, everyone depended on the land and on one another. My grandfather was one of 10 children. He had 9 siblings, and they grew up close, not just because they shared the same home, but because survival itself depended on cooperation. Their parents did what they could to provide, and like many families of that time and place, they lived modestly, but with a strong sense of belonging. It was a life built on familiarity and predictability, and that is what made what came next so devastating. When the war spread into their region, it brought fear long before it brought soldiers. Rumors traveled faster than armies. Stories of villages being burned, of people being executed, of entire communities disappearing overnight. Guerrilla fighters were active in the area, resisting occupation in whatever ways they could. They used the terrain they knew so well, hiding in forests, striking when they could, then vanishing again. The Nazis believed that villages like my grandfather's were sheltering these fighters, whether they actually were or not. When word reached the village that German forces were coming in retaliation for guerrilla attacks, panic set in. People knew what that usually meant. Retribution did not require proof. It did not require guilt. It only required suspicion. Many of the young men understood this immediately. They didn't wait to find out what would happen. They fled into the hills, the forests, anywhere they thought might give them a chance to survive. Leaving meant abandoning their homes, their families, and everything familiar. But staying could mean death. Not everyone could run. Some were too old, some were too young. Some stayed behind because they had nowhere to go, or because they believed, desperately, that if they did nothing wrong, nothing bad would happen to them. That belief would prove tragically misplaced. When the Nazis arrived, they moved quickly and brutally. There was no negotiation, no explanation. The men who were still in the village were rounded up and lined up against a wall. There was no trial, no questioning. They were simply shot, executed in front of their neighbors, their families, their children. Lives ended in seconds, erased as if they had never mattered. My grandfather was not among those men. He was still a boy at the time. His survival was not the result of chance alone, but of a decision his mother made under unimaginable pressure. When the soldiers began rounding up the villagers, his mother understood something terrible. She knew that the Nazis were not there to intimidate. They were there to destroy. She realized that if they stayed together as a family, there was a real possibility that all of her children would die. And so she made a choice no parent should ever have to make. She split her children in half. She took the youngest ones, including my grandfather, and hid them in the cellar beneath their house. It was dark, cramped, and terrifying, but it was hidden. She told them to stay quiet no matter what they heard, no matter how afraid they were. Then she took the other half of her children with her as the Nazis forced the villagers into the church. The church, normally a place of refuge and comfort, became a holding place for fear. The Nazis locked people inside, cramming families together, children clinging to parents, everyone unsure of what would happen next. My grandfather's mother didn't know if the church would become a mass grave. She didn't know if it would be set on fire. She only knew that spreading her children out gave them a chance. Not a guarantee, just a chance. While the villagers were trapped inside the church, the Nazis ransacked the village. They went from house to house, looting what they wanted, destroying what they didn't. Nearly every home was burned to the ground, including my grandfather's. In the cellar beneath that house, my grandfather and his siblings could hear it happening. They could hear boots on the floor above them. They could hear shouting, glass breaking, wood splintering. And then they could feel the heat. The house burned above their heads, flames consuming everything they had ever known. Smoke filled the cellar. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. They didn't know if the fire would reach them. They didn't know if the house would collapse. They were children, hidden underground, listening to their world being destroyed. Somehow, they survived. The fire did not reach them. The cellar held. When the destruction finally ended and the soldiers moved on, those children emerged to a village that barely existed anymore. Their home was gone. Their possessions were gone. Their sense of safety was gone. But they were alive. Those trapped in the church also survived that particular day, though many others in the village did not. Families were shattered. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. Entire bloodlines ended in a single afternoon. The survivors were left to mourn among ashes and ruins, surrounded by the silence that follows extreme violence. But the suffering did not end there. Sometime after the village was destroyed, the Nazis returned. This time they came not to burn, but to exploit. They forced the remaining young men and boys, including my grandfather, to work for them. They were made to build roads and fortifications, to carry materials, to labor under harsh conditions with little food and no choice. Refusal was not an option. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear became part of daily life. My grandfather was still growing, still a child in many ways, yet he was treated as expendable labor. He worked under the watch of armed soldiers, knowing that any mistake, any sign of weakness, could have fatal consequences. The trauma of what he had already witnessed did not earn him mercy. It only made survival harder. Despite everything, he lived. Against overwhelming odds, my grandfather and the siblings who survived that day in the cellar made it through the war. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but alive. Many members of the extended family were not so fortunate. Their names became memories instead of futures. Their stories ended too soon. The village itself never truly recovered. Even if it was rebuilt physically, something essential was lost. The sense of continuity, the trust that tomorrow would resemble today, the belief that home was permanent. The war left scars that could not be seen from the outside. My grandfather carried them quietly. Like many survivors, he didn't talk about it much. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Trauma of that scale doesn't always come out in words. Sometimes it shows up in silences, in habits, in fears passed down without explanation. His mother's decision that day defined everything that followed. By splitting her children, she ensured that at least some of them would live. It was an act of love born out of terror, a calculation no one should ever have to make. There is no way to measure the strength it took to walk away from the half of her children, not knowing if she would ever see them again. That choice echoes through generations. It is the reason I am here. the reason my family exists as it does today. Survival, in this case, was not heroic or triumphant. It was desperate, painful, and incomplete. It came with loss that never fully healed. When people talk about war in abstract terms, about battles and strategies and victories, stories like this are what get lost. This is what war actually looks like. Villages erased, families torn apart, children hiding underground while their homes burn, mothers making impossible choices, boys forced into labor by the same people who murdered their neighbors. The fact that my grandfather survived does not make the story less tragic. It makes it more complicated. Survival is not the end of suffering. It is the beginning of a long process of living with what you have seen and what you have lost. Even now, generations later, the weight of that history remains. It lives in family stories, in the knowledge of how close everything came to ending. It serves as a reminder of how fragile ordinary life is, and how quickly cruelty can descend when power is wielded without restraint. The village may no longer exist in the way it once did, but its story does, and as long as it is remembered. The people who were killed there are not completely erased. They are more than victims of history. They were fathers, sons, brothers, neighbors. They lived. They mattered. And because one mother made an impossible choice in the face of unimaginable violence, some of them survived to carry that memory forward. This will probably get buried, and I don't know if it's the kind of story people expect when they ask for something creepy or disturbing, but it's one of those experiences that lodged itself in my chest and never really left. There's nothing supernatural about it. No jump scare, no twist ending. Just the slow, awful realization of how close violence can be, how quietly it can exist right next to ordinary life, and how much you can miss even when you're paying attention. I work in emergency communications. It's a job that teaches you very quickly how to compartmentalize. You learn how to take calls from people on the worst day of their lives, stay calm, gather information, and move on to the next call. You hear terrible things, but most of the time they stay on the other side of the phone. You don't see the blood. You don't smell the smoke. You don't feel the weight of it physically. You hang up, document, and keep going. That day was different. I came into work right after a double murder-suicide. A man had killed his wife and his adult daughter, then taken his own life. The details were still coming in when I arrived. There was that strange, heavy energy in the room that only shows up after something truly bad has happened. People were quieter than usual, movements more deliberate, voices lower. You could feel it before anyone even said anything. One of my coworkers was visibly shaken. He wasn't new. He wasn't inexperienced. He'd handled plenty of awful calls before, but this one had gotten to him in a way that was obvious the moment you looked at him. He kept glancing down at himself, tugging at his sleeves, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Eventually, someone asked him what was wrong. He said he had blood on him. He explained that he'd tried to help the daughter. He'd been there in the immediate aftermath, close enough to get her blood on his clothes. He hadn't had time to go home and change before his shift, and there was no spare uniform available. So he was sitting there, answering emergency calls, wearing clothes that still had her blood on them. That alone was horrifying. The idea of carrying that physical reminder of someone's last moments while continuing to do your job, listening to other people's emergencies, pretending everything was normal. It made my stomach turn, and I remember thinking how unfair it was that he had to carry that with him for the rest of the day. At the time, the victims were just names: a wife, a daughter, tragic, but still abstract in that way that tragedies often are when they haven't connected themselves to your personal life yet. I felt sad, of course, angry, numb in that familiar professional way. I did my shift, handled my calls, and tried not to think too hard about the details. It wasn't until the end of my shift that everything shifted. I found out the daughter was my husband's friend and co-worker. The words didn't register at first. It took a moment for my brain to catch up, to align the name I'd heard earlier with an actual person. Then it hit me all at once. I had met her. Not many times. Just once. But I remembered her immediately. A few weeks before all of this, I had been hanging out with my husband and some of his co-workers. She was there that night. We weren't close. We didn't exchange numbers or make plans to see each other again. But she was kind, warm, the kind of person who makes an effort to include someone new without making it obvious or awkward. I remember talking to her for a bit. Just casual conversation. At some point, she mentioned that she had moved back home to help her mom. She said it in such a normal, offhand way that I didn't think much of it. I assumed her mom was sick, or maybe had mobility issues, or needed help around the house. That's usually what people mean when they say something like that. It didn't raise any red flags for me at the time. Looking back, that assumption haunts me, because now I realize she didn't mean help her mom with an illness or aging. She meant help her mom survive her dad. She didn't spell it out. She didn't complain. She didn't say anything overtly alarming. But there were hints, subtle ones that only make sense in hindsight. The way she spoke carefully. The way she seemed alert to emotional undercurrents in the room. The way she watched interactions more than she participated in them. There was one moment that night that stands out to me now in a way it didn't then. My husband and I were fighting at the time. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just one of those quiet, tense periods where everything feels brittle. At some point that evening, we had a brief interaction about his drinking. It wasn't a blow-up, just a few words exchanged, tight voices, a pause that lingered a little too long. No one else noticed. No one else reacted. Except her. She clocked it immediately. I saw it in her face. A flicker of recognition. Not judgment, not gossip, just understanding. Like she had seen that exact dynamic before and knew exactly what it meant. After that, she made a point of including me more, sitting closer, looping me into conversations, making small jokes, asking me questions, trying gently and quietly to make me feel better. At the time, I thought she was just perceptive, empathetic, the kind of person who picks up on vibes and wants everyone to feel okay. I remember thinking that her home life must be a little dysfunctional for her to be so attuned to that kind of tension. But I had no idea how bad it really was. Finding out what happened reframed that entire evening in a way that made my chest ache. She wasn't just sensitive. She was experienced. She had lived in a house where tension wasn't just uncomfortable, but dangerous. Where reading a room wasn't a personality trait, but a survival skill. She had moved back home not because she wanted to, but because she felt she had to, because she was trying to protect her mother, because she saw something coming, even if she couldn't name it or stop it. And it still wasn't enough. That's the part that really gets me. She did what so many adult children do in abusive households. She went back. She tried to help. She tried to buffer, to mediate, to absorb some of the damage so her mother wouldn't have to take it all. She put herself back in harm's way out of love and responsibility and hoped that maybe this time things would be different. And it cost her her life. I think about the fact that I was hanging out with her just weeks before she died. sitting in the same room, laughing at the same jokes, complaining about normal, everyday things. I think about how close she was to the end of her life and how none of us knew, how she still showed up to work, still socialized, still tried to be kind to strangers like me. I think about my coworker, sitting at his desk with her blood on his clothes, answering calls like nothing was wrong. I think about how many people were connected to her in small, invisible ways, and how all of us carried a piece of that day without realizing it at first. There's something uniquely disturbing about violence that happens inside a family. Not because it's rarer, but because it's so often invisible until it's too late. From the outside, it looks like stress, like tension, like someone moving back home to help out, like a daughter who's a little too good at reading the room. And then suddenly it's a headline, a police report, a shift change conversation. I don't think of her as a victim in the abstract sense. I think of her as the woman who noticed I was unhappy and tried to make me smile. The woman who picked up on a subtle interaction that no one else saw. The woman who carried more than she should have had to, right up until the end. I also think about how easy it is to underestimate danger when it's familiar. How often we tell ourselves that things are bad, but not that bad. That someone's difficult, but not dangerous. That love and proximity can somehow neutralize harm. This story didn't scare me in the way ghost stories do. It didn't make me jump or look over my shoulder. It scared me in a quieter, deeper way. It made me think about how much people hide, how much they normalize, how much they endure without ever saying the words out loud. And it made me realize how thin the line is between an uncomfortable situation and a fatal one. I still think about her sometimes, about that night, about the way she looked at me with understanding before I even knew what she was seeing. I wish I had known more. I wish she had been safe. I wish helping her mom hadn't meant putting herself directly in the path of someone capable of that kind of violence. It's not the creepiest story in a dramatic sense, but it's one that changed the way I look at people, at tension, at the quiet signals we sometimes ignore because they don't seem urgent enough. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that feel almost normal right up until they aren't. Oh. In college at the time, sitting in what I expected to be a fairly dry ethics class, the kind where you talk about hypotheticals, moral frameworks, case studies that feel distant and abstract. One day, our professor told us we'd have a guest speaker, a firefighter. He said it would be relevant to the course, but he didn't really explain how. Most of us assumed it would be about decision-making under pressure or public service or something along those lines. None of us were prepared for what he actually told us. The firefighter was older, not dramatic in the way you might expect from someone telling a tragic story. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't embellish. He spoke calmly, almost clinically at times, which somehow made everything he said hit harder. You could tell this was a story he had told before, not because it had become easier, but because it had settled into him in a way that never really leaves. He started by explaining the background, a family-owned septic and the wastewater company. Small operation. Not a big corporation cutting corners on a massive scale, just a family business that had been running for years. The kind of company where everyone knows each other, where work and family are completely intertwined. The father ran it. His sons worked with him. They did the dirty jobs most people don't want to think about, let alone do. On this particular day, they were working on a septic tank. Routine maintenance, nothing out of the ordinary. These tanks are dangerous, but when you've been around them long enough, Familiarity can breed a false sense of safety. The firefighter explained that there are gases involved. Hydrogen sulfide among them that can knock a person unconscious almost instantly. You don't get a warning. You don't get time to realize something is wrong. One breath can be enough. The youngest brother went in first. There was a leak in a hose, something small, something that probably didn't seem urgent or obvious at the time. He didn't realize the danger until it was too late. He passed out inside the tank. From the outside, it didn't look dramatic. There was no explosion, no screaming, just silence. The oldest brother noticed something was wrong when his younger brother didn't respond. He did what most people would do without thinking. He went in to pull him out. He passed out too. Then the second brother realized something was seriously wrong. Two people not responding. Panic sets in. Logic disappears. He went in after them. No, he passed out. At this point, the father knew something was terribly wrong. His sons weren't coming back out. He didn't have protective gear that would have saved him. He didn't stop to think about gas levels or oxygen or protocol. He saw his children in danger. He went in. He passed out as well. 4 people, all unconscious, all overcome by the same invisible threat, stacked one after another in a space that was never meant to be entered without proper equipment. By the time emergency services were called, it was already too late. The firefighter telling us this story was part of the team that responded. He described arriving on scene and realizing immediately what they were dealing with. This wasn't a rescue, it was a recovery. There was nothing they could do to save them. He talked about the difficulty of retrieving the bodies, about how they weren't equipped to just go in and pull people out the way everyone imagines, about the careful, methodical process required to avoid adding more bodies to the count, about the weight of what they were pulling out, not just physically, but emotionally. And then he talked about the mother. She wasn't there when it happened. She arrived later. She arrived to find her entire family gone. Her husband, her sons, her life, erased in the span of minutes. The firefighter didn't linger on her reaction in a sensational way. He didn't need to. He simply said that people tried to comfort her, but there was nothing anyone could say. There is no comfort for someone who loses everyone all at once, not to illness, not to an accident that takes one person at a time, but all of them, in one day, in one place. He said the thing that haunted him most was knowing how preventable it was. The equipment they needed existed. The gear that could have saved them was standard. It wasn't some cutting-edge technology. It was something they should have replaced, but didn't. Maybe it was expensive. Maybe they thought they could get by a little longer. Maybe nothing bad had ever happened before, so it felt safe enough. That decision, that one delay, cost an entire family their lives. He talked about how often this kind of thing happens. Not just in septic work, but in all kinds of industries. People get comfortable, they cut corners, they tell themselves it'll be fine this time, and most of the time it is, until it isn't. Sitting there in that classroom, listening to him describe pulling 4 bodies out of a tank while their wife and mother stood there watching, something shifted in me. It wasn't abstract anymore. Ethics wasn't about thought experiments or philosophical debates. It was about real people making small decisions that ripple outward in ways they can't undo. What stuck with me most wasn't just the horror of how they died. It was the chain reaction. One person goes down and love takes over. Instinct takes over. Family loyalty overrides logic. Each person who went in wasn't being reckless in their own mind. They were trying to save someone they loved. That's what made it so devastating. By the end of his talk, the room was completely silent. No one was checking their phones. No one was whispering. A few people were crying quietly. The firefighter didn't ask for applause. He just nodded to the professor and left. I still think about that story more often than I'd like. About how danger doesn't always announce itself. About how invisible threats can be more deadly than obvious ones. About how quickly a normal workday can turn into something irreversible. And I think about that mother standing there, watching strangers retrieve the bodies of her entire family, knowing that a piece of equipment, a decision made weeks or months earlier, might have changed everything. It's one of those stories that doesn't fade. It doesn't shock you in a loud way. It just settles into you, heavy and quiet, and stays there. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. Recently, something happened that rattled me in a way I wasn't expecting, especially because it came out of nowhere and hit an old nerve I thought I'd buried years ago. I was sitting at my desk late at night, scrolling through Reddit, killing time the way you do when you're not quite ready to sleep. It was pitch black outside, the kind of dark where your window turns into a mirror and you can't see anything beyond the glass. I had the window open because it was a little stuffy in the room, and everything was quiet. No TV on, no music, just the soft hum of my computer and the occasional night sound drifting in. Then, out of nowhere, a voice came from just outside the window. It was deep, raspy, too close. It said very clearly, "Hey, fella." I swear my soul tried to leave my body. I jumped so hard my chair screeched backward. Yeah, my heart instantly pounding like I'd just been dropped into ice water. I didn't stop to think, didn't try to look, didn't say a word. I lunged forward and slammed the window shut as fast as I could, hands shaking so badly I fumbled with the latch for a second before locking it. I stood there frozen, staring at the glass, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no voice, no movement. Just silence and my own breathing, loud and uneven in my ears. I don't answer the door. Ever. I don't care who it is or what time it is. And I sure as hell am not answering a window in the middle of the night. Whoever or whatever that was, they weren't getting a response from me. I backed away slowly, turned on every light in the room, and sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just some random person messing around. Or maybe someone walking by who thought it would be funny. But the way it sounded, the tone, the closeness, the way it felt like it was directed only at me, it stirred up something old, something I hadn't thought about in years. Because that wasn't the first time I'd heard a voice like that. When I was a kid, there was this basement. Every house has a basement story, but this one was different for me. I don't know why it scared me so much. Nothing bad had ever happened there that I knew of. It wasn't especially dark or moldy or full of spiders. It was just a basement, concrete floor, exposed beams, shelves along the walls, and a large walk-in closet at the far end. But I hated it. I mean, truly hated it. The kind of fear that doesn't make sense and doesn't need a reason. My stomach would knot up just standing at the top of the stairs. I never liked going down there alone, and if I had to, I'd do it as fast as possible. Lights blazing, heart racing, imagining something just out of sight behind me. One day, my whole family was outside at the far end of the yard. I was playing with my parents and grandparents, running around, having fun, when I suddenly remembered a toy I really wanted. Of course, it was in the basement. Of course, no one wanted to go get it for me. They brushed me off, told me to get it myself, said there was nothing to be scared of. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. I didn't want to be the scared kid. I didn't want to miss out. So I decided I was going to do it. I walked up to the house alone. As soon as I opened the door, that familiar dread crept in. The house felt quieter without everyone else in it. I made my way to the basement door, opened it, and stared down the stairs. The darkness below felt heavy, like it was waiting. I took a breath and started down. With every step, I chanted under my breath, "There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts." Over and over like a spell. Like if I said it enough times, it would protect me. My voice shook at first, but I forced it louder as I went down each step. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner, still chanting. The basement light cast long shadows along the walls. Everything looked normal, exactly the same as always. But my fear only grew. I could feel it pressing in on me, crawling up my spine. The walk-in closet was at the far end of the basement. Of course my toy was in there. Of course it was all the way in the back. I kept chanting as I walked toward it, my voice getting louder, more desperate. I opened the closet door. It creaked slightly, the sound echoing in the quiet space. Shelves lined the walls, boxes stacked haphazardly, old coats hanging limp. I stepped inside, halfway into the closet, reached for the pull cord to turn on the light, and grabbed my toy from the bag. In that moment, flooded with adrenaline and relief, I shouted, "There's no such thing as ghosts!" And then I heard it. A laugh. Not a chuckle. Not a human laugh. It was deep, low, and inhuman. Like it came from somewhere that wasn't meant to produce sound. It filled the basement instantly, wrapping around me, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't far away. It felt close. Too close. The fear that hit me was overwhelming. It wasn't just being scared. It was pure, primal terror. My vision narrowed, my ears rang, and for a split second, I genuinely thought I was going to pass out right there. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran so fast, my feet slipped on the concrete, scrambling for traction like something out of a cartoon before I took off. I bolted out of the closet, across the basement, up the stairs, screaming at the top of my lungs. I burst through the back door and didn't stop until I reached my family at the end of the yard, sobbing and gasping for air. I tried to tell them what happened. I told them about the laugh, about how it sounded, about how terrified I was. They didn't believe me. They laughed it off, told me I imagined it, said I scared myself because I already didn't like the basement. They chalked it up to a kid's imagination and moved on. The only person who believed me was my grandmother. Later, when she thought I wasn't listening, I heard her say to my parents very quietly, "I told you something was in the basement." That sentence has stayed with me my entire life. I never went into that basement again. Not alone. Not with someone else. Not ever. If I needed something from down there, it could stay there. Years passed. I grew up. I told myself it was just a childhood fear, a trick of the mind, a memory exaggerated by time. I stopped thinking about it until that night at my desk, until a deep, raspy voice spoke to me from the darkness outside my window, and my body reacted before my brain could catch up. I don't know who it was. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it's connected or if my mind just made the connection on its own. But I do know this. Some fears don't come from nothing. And some memories don't fade because they were never meant to. And whatever was in that basement back then, whatever laughed at me when I was a kid, I've never fully believed it stayed there. This is one of those stories that feels too close to home. The kind that doesn't fade because it's tangled up with real people, familiar places, and the unsettling realization that something horrific happened right where ordinary life was going on. A family friend of ours had an uncle who was murdered in Colby, Wisconsin. His name was Robert Pogue. The person who killed him wasn't a stranger or some random criminal. It was his former best friend, Dean Allen, along with Dean's wife, Janice Allen. That part alone is hard to wrap your head around. Betrayal layered on top of violence, all wrapped up in personal history. From what I understand, the situation started when Janice contacted Dean after she had run off with Robert. She told Dean she regretted leaving, that she wanted out, that she needed to be rescued. Whether that was manipulation, panic, or something darker is hard to say. But Dean believed her, or at least believed enough to show up at the apartment in Colby where Robert and Janice were staying. What happened next was brutal. Instead of leaving together or confronting the situation and walking away, Dean and Janice turned on Robert. Together, they killed him inside that apartment. Someone he trusted. Someone he had called a friend. The violence didn't stop there. After he was dead, they dismembered his body, cutting him into pieces, stuffing the remains into garbage bags. Those bags were then driven out and dumped along the side of the highway, scattered throughout the county. Not even the dignity of being left in one place. Just pieces of a person, discarded like trash. The case eventually became well known, especially locally. It was later featured on a true crime show under the title The Butcher, which only added another layer of horror to it for people who already knew the story. Seeing something so close to home turned into content is unsettling in its own way. There's another detail that has always stuck with me because it makes the whole thing feel even more surreal. The father of a guy I graduated with was involved in investigating the case. According to what I've heard, he played a key role in getting a confession out of Janice. The story goes that she became infatuated with him during the investigation, convinced herself that he cared about her, and believed he would help her get out of prison so they could run away together. That delusion, that misplaced trust, is reportedly what led her to confess. Whether every detail of that is exactly right or not, the idea of someone being so detached from reality after committing such a crime is chilling on its own. And then there's the apartment. My dad once told me, almost casually, that he had partied in that very apartment years before the murder. Just normal get-togethers, drinks, music, people laughing. Nothing sinister at the time. Knowing that later someone would be killed and dismembered in that same space makes it hard not to think about how violence can hide in plain sight. How ordinary places can quietly carry extraordinary darkness. That's what makes the story linger. It's not just about the crime itself, though that's horrific enough. It's about how close it was, how intertwined it is with people I know, places I recognize, stories I grew up hearing. It's about realizing that something unimaginably violent can happen in a small town, in an apartment where people once hung out, committed by people who once called each other friends. Those are the stories that don't let you fully relax. The ones that remind you that evil doesn't always look like a monster from the outside. Sometimes it looks like a friend, a spouse, a familiar face, until it's far too late. When my brother was in 10th grade, he stayed over at a friend's house one night with a group of kids they were all close to. It was nothing unusual, just a typical high school sleepover. A bunch of boys sprawled out on couches and floors, junk food everywhere, video games, music. That loud, restless energy teenagers have when they're supposed to be asleep but aren't. No one thought twice about it. These were kids who had grown up together, gone to school together, spent years in each other's houses. At some point during the night, one of the boys said he had to run out and take care of something. I don't know exactly what excuse he gave. It probably didn't even register as important. Teenagers leave all the time, especially if they live nearby. Nobody questioned it. He left the house, and the rest of them stayed behind laughing, talking, doing whatever kids do at 2 or 3 in the morning. What none of them knew was that he went home and murdered his entire family. He shot them all, his parents, his younger brothers who were still in middle school. Those boys weren't just names to us. My sister knew them well. She was close with them. They were kids who had been in our house, kids whose voices and faces were familiar. They were just gone, killed in their own home by someone who had been joking and hanging out with friends less than an hour earlier. After he did it, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He went back to the sleepover house. He walked back in like nothing had happened. He sat down with the rest of them. He talked. He laughed. He acted completely normal. No one noticed anything off. No blood on him. No visible panic. No breakdown. Just another kid coming back from wherever he said he was going. My brother slept in the same house as him that night, completely unaware of what had just taken place. That part alone is hard to process. The idea that someone could commit something so violent and then slip back into normality so seamlessly. That there were kids lying on the floor, half asleep, while the person next to them had just wiped out his entire family. But it gets worse. The next day, he planned a party at his house. A party. He invited people over for the following night, knowing full well that his family's bodies were still inside the house. They hadn't been discovered yet. They were still lying where they had fallen. And he was inviting friends over like it was just another weekend hangout. At some point, someone must have gotten suspicious. Maybe it was the behavior. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe someone heard something they couldn't quite explain. The police caught wind of the party and shut it down before it really got going. When they went inside the house, they found the truth. I don't know all the details of that moment, and honestly, I don't want to. Just knowing that police walked into a house expecting to break up a teenage party and instead found an entire family murdered is enough to turn your stomach. That house went from being a normal suburban home to a crime scene in an instant. The shock rippled outward fast. My brother came home different, quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't talk about it much at first, but you could tell it had shaken him. How could it not? Someone he had trusted, slept in the same house with, joked around with, turned out to be capable of something so horrific. It messes with your sense of reality. It makes you question how well you really know anyone. For our family, the horror didn't end with the arrest. For years afterward, my brother's friend called our house from jail. He would call the landline. Always the landline. Back then, you couldn't screen calls easily. You'd be sitting down to dinner, plates on the table, everyone talking about their day, and the phone would ring. That sharp, intrusive ring that cuts through everything. Someone would pick it up, and it would be him, calling from jail. Sometimes my brother would talk to him. At first, he felt conflicted. They had history. They had memories together. It's hard to reconcile the person you knew with the person who did something like that. There's guilt in cutting someone off, even when they've done the unforgivable. There's confusion. There's denial. There's that lingering thought that maybe, somehow, The person you knew still exists somewhere underneath what they did. Those calls went on for years. They became a kind of haunting presence in our house. Not loud or dramatic, just this constant reminder that something horrible had brushed up against our lives and never fully left. We'd be eating dinner, passing food, talking about school or work, and suddenly, there it was. The voice of someone who had murdered his family, coming through the receiver, asking to speak to my brother. It changed the atmosphere every time, even when my brother wasn't home. The calls would still come. Sometimes my parents would answer. Sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they'd hang up immediately. Other times they'd tell him my brother wasn't available. But just hearing his name, knowing who was on the other end of the line, was enough to make the room feel heavy. Eventually, my brother stopped answering. There wasn't a big announcement. He just stopped. He stopped picking up the phone when it was him. He stopped returning calls. He stopped engaging. At some point, he realized that whatever connection he felt to that person was outweighed by the reality of what he had done. There was no version of friendship that could survive that. The calls tapered off after that, but the memory of them didn't. Even now, years later, I can still picture those dinners. The phone ringing, the pause in conversation, the look that would pass between us when we realized who it was, that sense of unease settling over the table, like a cold draft through an open door. What haunts me the most isn't just the violence itself, though that's horrifying enough. It's the closeness of it. The fact that this wasn't some distant news story or faceless crime. This was someone who had been in our orbit. Someone whose voice came through our phone. Someone my brother had trusted enough to sleep in the same house with. It's the realization that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like kids at a sleepover. Sometimes they laugh at the same jokes, play the same games, complain about the same teachers. Sometimes they leave for a bit, come back, and no one notices anything wrong. It makes you think about how fragile normalcy really is, how thin the line is between an ordinary night and something that permanently alters multiple families' lives. One moment, a group of teenagers is hanging out, worrying about school and friendships. The next, an entire family is gone, and nothing will ever be the same. I think about my sister sometimes, about the younger boys she knew, the ones who were killed, kids who never got to grow up, who never got to leave middle school behind, who never got the chance to become anything beyond what they were at that moment. I think about how casually we assume there will always be more time. And I think about my brother having to carry that knowledge for the rest of his life, knowing that he shared laughter and space with someone capable of that level of violence, knowing that he slept peacefully while, just miles away, something unspeakable had happened. Now that's the part that never really leaves you, not the headlines, not the court proceedings, not even the details of the crime itself. It's the phone ringing during dinner. It's the voice on the other end. It's the way ordinary life keeps going, even when something unimaginably wrong has already happened. I worked with her in the early 90s in southwestern Pennsylvania. Her name was Jolene. We weren't best friends, but we were close enough that her absence later felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain. She was one of those people who fit easily into a workplace. Friendly without being fake, quiet without being withdrawn. The kind of person you could talk to during a break and feel a little lighter afterward. At the time, I didn't know much about her personal life. We talked about work, weekend plans, small things. I had no idea she was seeing someone. And I definitely didn't know that the man she was involved with already had a girlfriend. None of that was public knowledge. If Jolene knew the full situation, she never shared it with me, and if she didn't, then she was being lied to, just like everyone else in that kind of mess. What I learned later came out in pieces, through news reports and hushed conversations. Apparently, the man she was seeing had been in a long-term relationship. When his girlfriend found out about Jolene, she ended things. Instead of taking responsibility for his own choices, instead of sitting with the consequences of what he had done, he decided to blame Jolene for everything, as if she had ruined his life by existing in it. That kind of thinking still chills me. The way some people can shift all their guilt and anger onto someone else, convincing themselves that the other person deserves punishment for their own mistakes. In early 1996, he contacted Jolene and asked her to meet him. He suggested a popular spot that young people in the area used to go to drink. It was one of those places everyone knew about, but no one officially acknowledged. A place that felt harmless because it had always been there. Kids went there to hang out, to drink, to feel rebellious without really thinking about the danger. The spot was near an old vertical mine shaft, a relic from when mining had been the backbone of the region. The shaft was deep, estimated to be around 900 feet. Over time, kids had laid a wooden plank across part of it, a crude bridge of sorts. People would sit on that plank, legs dangling, laughing, drinking, dropping empty bottles down the darkness just to hear how long it took before they hit something far below. It was reckless, but it had become normalized. Nothing bad had happened there before, at least not that anyone talked about. That night, Jolene met him there. They sat together on that plank, above a hole that most people treated like a novelty instead of what it really was, a vertical drop into nothingness, with hundreds of feet of open air and water at the bottom. No one knows exactly what was said between them. I don't know if they argued. I don't know if she thought they were there to talk things through, to get closure, to end things peacefully. I don't know if she trusted him in that moment or if she felt uneasy but stayed anyway, trying to be polite, trying to be reasonable. What we do know is that at some point, he pushed her. There was no accident, no slip, no loss of balance. He shoved her off the plank and into the shaft. 900 feet. When I first heard that detail, my mind couldn't process it. I kept trying to imagine the fall, and every time my thoughts went there, I had to stop. The idea of that much empty space beneath you, the sudden realization that there's nothing to grab onto, nowhere to land, is unbearable to think about. I still don't know how long it would take to fall that far. I don't know if there was time to scream, to think, to feel fear. I don't know if she lost consciousness quickly or if she was aware for longer than anyone should ever have to be. At the bottom of the shaft, there was water, a couple 100 feet of it. Even that detail doesn't bring comfort. Falling into water from that height is not gentle. It's not like jumping into a lake. It's like hitting concrete. When authorities tried to recover her body, they brought in cave divers. 2 of them went down into that shaft, descending into darkness that most people will never experience. What they found wasn't a body in any recognizable sense. They found pieces. That word alone haunted me. Pieces. Her hair was found stuck to the side of the shaft in places, caught on rough stone as her body fell. That image has never left me. It's the kind of detail that lodges itself in your brain and refuses to go away, no matter how much you wish it would. I had nightmares for weeks after the story came out. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, my mind replaying images I had never actually seen but couldn't stop imagining. Even now, decades later, I can't think about it for too long. If I let my mind linger on the details, the fear and sadness come rushing back like it just happened yesterday. What hurts almost as much as the violence itself is how senseless it was. Jolene didn't deserve any of it. She didn't betray anyone. She didn't ruin anyone's life. She was a woman who got involved with the wrong person, and instead of dealing with his own guilt and consequences, he decided to destroy her. I think about her sometimes in quiet moments, about how she laughed at work, about how ordinary her life was before it ended in such an extraordinary, brutal way, about how someone can go to work alongside you, share coffee and small talk, and then be gone forever because someone else couldn't face their own mistakes. I also think about that mine shaft, about how many people sat on that plank before and after, never knowing what had happened there, or knowing and still going anyway. How places can carry memories even when the world moves on around them. How violence doesn't always leave visible scars on the land, but it leaves them on the people who remember. More than anything, I hope she didn't suffer long. I hope she passed out quickly. I hope fear didn't have time to fully take hold. That hope might be irrational, but it's the only small mercy I can give her in my thoughts. Some stories don't fade. They don't become distant or abstract. They stay sharp, painful, and close, no matter how much time passes. Jolene's story is one of those for me. It's a reminder of how quickly trust can be weaponized, how fragile safety really is, and how one person's refusal to take responsibility can end another person's life in the most horrific way imaginable. I don't think I'll ever be able to bear thinking about it for very long. And maybe that's okay. Some things aren't meant to be revisited endlessly. Some things are meant to be remembered quietly, with sadness and respect, and then set down again before they break you. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.